Our next panel continues the discussion on redefining art and culture in cities. How are artists shaping cities and developing creative solutions to urban challenges? Please welcome moderator Caroline Daniel of the Brunswick Group, artist Alexandre Farto, aka Vhils, of Vhils Studio, Sarah Herda of the Graham Foundation, and Mark Davy of Futurecity and Future Pace.
So it's a great pleasure for me to be back in Chicago. I lived in the city from 2002 to 2005. It is a great cultural city. And I always know, and the reason I lived here is that I always know this is the best time of year to come back to Chicago, having lived here. And I was here during the launch of Millennium Park. And I always remember the great anecdote about Anish Kapoor, who I interviewed at the time when it was being started. And actually, what's amazing about Cloudgate is it wasn't supposed to be where it is right now, reflecting the city. It was actually supposed to be called Cloudgate, reflecting the sky. But it turned out to be too darn heavy that they had to end up putting it over the car park and moving it. So I love the fact that it's an accident of public art, that it's become this great icon of the city life, rather than just sort of the clouds of city. And the other great thing about that piece of public art is he had to negotiate with the city of Chicago and Mayor Daley. And in his contract, it said his piece had to last for 1,000 years. So in 1,000 years' time, Mayor Daley the 20th may be able to renegotiate the contract with Anish Kapoor the 20th as well. Anyway, I think this is always a fun, great panel. We have a great section of panelists. I'd love to start with Vhils, the artist. Not that although we're apparently all artists these days. So no, Vhils the better artist than us. And what I'd love to start with is some of the work you've been doing in Lisbon, and particularly around how you're bridging the gap between the sort of local artists and the city.
I thank you for having me. Well, I started as an artist myself, and with graffiti, painting on the streets, and working on a public space. And it was, working on a public space was always something very important to me as an artist, and it was something that gave me a lot at the beginning. And later on, my career evolved, but I always kind of tried to do the bridge between kind of subcultures that were working in the city, from graffiti, street art, or people that were doing installations in the public space. They were kind of part of all my environments of growing up as an artist. And at one point, there was a crisis in Portugal, and specifically Lisbon suffered quite a lot of cutbacks, but it was kind of an opportunity as well to make a bridge between the community of artists that were doing a lot for the city already, which I see it as an energy that's a lot of cities let it dissipate and actually fight it and arrest artists and so on. But I found it as an opportunity because there was an open discussion with the council, which were open to projects that were bridging artists and the city. So we started a festival during a year where we had international artists and local artists together working on several identified areas that were kind of depressed in the city. And they actually did interventions on all of them, and the reaction first from the community as a cultural offer that was being given to it. They were quite happy and things moved on, but that's actually what was more interesting was the impact that it had socially and economically as well, because it kind of pushed areas in the city that were kind of depressed and bring them attention, and that had kind of an impact locally, and also in terms of communication there was a lot of attention from the media abroad, and that kind of put the city as a place where artists and artistic expression had space in the city, and that's kind of communicated the city as well. So,
can you bring to life a project? And I know you're going to share some of your work on an email later in terms so we can actually see it.
Yeah.
But can you just, annoyingly, I'm going to ask you to use your words to explain what kind of project you've been working on in the city in Lisbon.
Yeah, I mean, this first festival was kind of a kickoff that then the city understood the potential of it, and they created a department that was bridging and creating dialogues with artists and giving spaces in the city for basically freedom of expression and creating space for these artists. And one of them is that department, and the festival we created. And then there is several players in the city, from galleries to like independent curators that are kind of bridging artists with the council. But there is several that we'll share it after.
But as an artist, how far is there a moment when you feel sort of compromised by working with a local government or a state government, and they say, well, we want to have a nice art zone, you know, where does it become sort of decoration, you know, and you're basically paid, you know, to sort of create the art zone in a city versus genuinely being an act of public creative art?
I think that's the big challenge and the big discussion right now. I think illegal art in the public space will never stop happening. It's something that has been around since we began as a species, and I think that's a very internal will from us to interact with our surroundings and so on. But the challenges that exist, I think, they need to be discussed right now, as well as the fact that you need an independent department that can be close to an institution or museum that can create space for curators to defend the artist's works as well. Because if you don't defend the motto and the ideas that are behind the work, you end up doing decoration, as you said. And I think that's the big challenge that we have right now. We are talking about 2008, where the gentrification was not happening in a lot of, like in Lisbon particularly, but it was happening already in other places. And art in the public space goes a little bit with this. But it's important to keep the ideals of the artists and the intervention sides of art in the public space. Otherwise, it will be just decoration, and you will lose the value of what it actually can bring as an energy.
Yeah.
But I think artists have conscience of those challenges, and those are things that are being discussed right now. I think it's just there is a space of discussion, and that needs to happen to create an environment where artists can actually have their work with their ideals protected as well.
So, Sarah, I'd like to bring you in, because obviously you've worked for a long time in Chicago and also sort of advising in other cities. Who brings in the artists or the designers if you're on the city side? I think it's a really interesting sort of challenge about, you know, who is the right person to have at the table in the room to make our cities both engage with the public artists in the right way to allow them to be creative, but also to bring in, you know, other sort of forms of design and architecture at the table.
I mean, I think there's some interesting parallels between what Alexandre is talking about with artists doing unsanctioned work in the city, and then also fighting for the sort of integrity of those ideas. And I think more and more in design, we're seeing architects break out of the traditional mold of the client brief, and then the architect starts designing, you know, once they're commissioned. And a great example of that is a project that Jeannie Gang initiated in 2015. Some of you may remember that the Obama administration issued a 21st century report on policing, and that was in May of 15. And when Jeannie read the report, she noticed a big omission, and that was architecture, any reference to architecture. And if you think about policing, it's hard not to think about another aspect of it, which is incarceration, which is the actual police station. And so she started with her studio a completely independent project, started researching the police station and reimagining what it could be. And she arrived at this project, the police station, which you see one rendering of, and it sort of fundamentally changes the architecture and the intention of a police station. It becomes a kind of campus within a community. The station itself has integral public services, mental health, Wi-Fi, gyms, and we premiered this project at the first Chicago Architecture Biennial, and so that was actually the platform that gave this idea airtime, if you will, and from that, they actually started in North Lawndale, which she used as her case study. They broke ground during the biennial on a basketball hoop there to, again, just start to change the relationship between police and the communities that they serve, and using architecture to build different relationships. And since that, she's actually been brought into one of the largest, most important cities in our country to be at the table in an interdisciplinary group to rethink the police station in that city.
And in terms of some of the projects you've worked on in Chicago, is there any sort of one that you'd like to sort of draw attention to about who's invited in good design?
Well, I think that's, I mean, I feel like I and people that are in my position need to be an advocate for designers, because people, agencies, departments, companies are making design decisions every single day, and they're not really engaging necessarily designers. And in a city like Chicago, where you're thinking about not only cultivating a creative class, but keeping them here, then you have to be committed to creating opportunities for them at all scales. And so it's not only about the biggest firm working on the biggest project, but it's also about, we need a bike rack. So engage a young designer to do that project. We need a public bathroom. These are all small-scale projects that will make our city sort of daily life better, but also create opportunities for these offices and these young designers to build a career, because you don't just sort of come out of the gate and do a skyscraper. It really has to be, I think, an integral part of sort of every aspect in thinking about the city. I have one funny sort of anecdote, which is actually in Mexico City, where a new, very important museum was built, and a very famous architect built the building. And then one of the young curators commissioned a young design office from Mexico City to design everything that the important architect forgot. Stools for the guards, ashtrays, garbage cans. And this young office ended up creating a furniture line out of that and opening a small furniture store in central Mexico City, where they further developed this line of furniture, and it became a kind of creative space within the city. And so I think that no opportunity in a way is too small to apply design thinking and to get designers at the table. I mean, often designers are often close to the last of the table, but they can really contribute to articulating and making physical the ideas that so many different people have.
So if you were advising a mayor on this, what should they be doing to change that and to bring in more kind of designers of cool loos or dustbins? What should they practically be doing?
I think already the city is thinking about so many improving the city in so many ways. For instance, Mayor Lightfoot, we had a very violent weekend last weekend, and she said, this isn't only an issue of policing, it's also about what infrastructure we have in these communities. These are communities that have empty lots, and they don't have grocery stores or corner stores or any of the kind of amenities that we think about are necessary to sort of daily life. And to me, these are places to bring designers together to start thinking about how to bring these resources to more equitably distribute them throughout the city. So they're making decisions about design right now, but bring more designers to the table. And there's ways to also, I think, structurally do this, that one of the big issues ends up being procurement, how you can actually legally hire someone. And the Bloomberg administration, very early on in New York City, did a very interesting thing. They realized, actually it was the lawyers realized, the problem, we have all this talent in New York, we're not bringing them into the projects, the public works that we're doing, and the issue is how we are not able to hire them. So they looked at changing their procurement procurement process so they could pre-approve a pool of young designers or designers for certain scaled projects, and then for the next, they're still using those pools of architects to do public projects throughout the city.
So Mark, you travel around the world talking about cultural cities. What is the concept of a cultural city? How far is it just a kind of slogan, a made-up media concept? Does it really exist?
Yeah, I think the idea of a city of culture is becoming, is becoming a mainstream thing, and I guess that's linked to placemaking, which again is, I think, a fairly recent term in terms of the real estate sector. We've heard it throughout the conference, the idea that cities are becoming places where they're the factories for ideas. We're generators of IP, generators of concepts and ideas and thoughts and so on. So can we create cities that are creative, interesting, authentic places? So the arts have suddenly become kind of front and center because we are the people who generate that material. We do provoke and create opportunities. But the problem is that although the city of culture is still a strong idea, we're not really represented. So although most of the institutions of the city have structures and there's a sort of rigor, in the arts and culture, what is it? Who represents it? How does it get to the table? But there's no doubt now that authenticity and the idea of the individual, of experiential culture, is so sort of mainstream, and it doesn't matter whether it's the real estate or retail or new communities, or new redevelopments in brownfield and urban centres. It's becoming more a global thing. But I do think the issue for me has always been that artists and the arts sector, the cultural sector, doesn't really have representation in any meaningful way. So it tends to get dropped as almost the last thing, when we almost repair damage, or we come in as a kind of sop, or a sort of an element to something that's already decided. Particularly around master planning, for instance, in our cities. The cultural representation is zero, and when we first started working with real estate sector, which is predominantly what Futurecity does, I was shocked really at 11 years ago, the people at the table then are still the same people that are there now. So although the world has changed beyond recognition, you don't really get the sense that the people actually creating our cities are really allowing the sort of creative sector to have a presence. But maybe that's also our fault, because we don't offer that, there is no way of identifying the representative for that area.
So I'm interested, you talked about developers and the role of developers. So the British artist Rachel Whiteread came up with a great term for arbitrary acts of public sculpture funded by developers, and she called it plop art, yes. Which is about when you plop a piece of work. She called it plopping a piece of work down when it doesn't bear any relationship to anything else. And I think we all know horrible examples of plop art. In fact, one actually looked like a piece of poo recently, but I can't remember the name of the artist. Isn't there a danger, though, allowing the developer to be the arbiter of kind of public art? And in the UK, in London, for example, there's actually a way of funding it. It's part of a requirement that there's a sort of budget allocated to public art. Yeah. So I'd just be interested in given that you deal with the property industry, there are good and bad examples of how companies have used it well and how they're using it badly.
Yeah, yes, there's lots of bad public art, and often the reason for that is it's badly thought through and badly funded, and there's often never enough budget to do things well. If you're making a piece of public art, you're effectively creating a prototype that then goes out into the public realm without any testing. So an artist will make a piece of work, put it outside, and it gets weathered, the colours fade, and so on. But that, again, is just part and parcel of the problem of art being seen as a X marks the spot, landscape architect putting a mark on the ground where the art will go. The pieces you're seeing on the screen, there are 11 projects there. I don't know, you might think they're plop art. I would like to think that in each case, an artist has been pushed to the front of the queue, and they've had a meaningful relationship with the architects, the engineers, the real estate people, because what we've managed to do is say to the property developers, it's a good thing to have artists involved at the beginning. Let them be part of the dialogue which leads to the brief. Let them have a budget that's meaningful. Let them work with the kind of technicians and experts that you would usually use for your other parts of your real estate projects. And when there's one up there, London Bridge, these giant sort of structures by Mark Titchener that have gone into the new London Bridge station. The Illuminated River project, which was an architectural project to light the 15 bridges along the Thames, now has Leo Villarreal, US-Mexican artist, which will be the most extraordinary work you'll see as you fly into London. artists want access to those projects. They want to be at the front. They don't want to be at the back of the queue with the crumbs that are left over. So yes, but we're also, I think the other thing is we really beat ourselves up. There's a weird apologetic element to artists who sort of, immediately we sort of start to fight each other. So plop art is a bad term. Yes, there's bad public art, but surely shouldn't there just be great public art? And we'll never get that if the art is not pushed to the front of the thinking long before master planners, architects start placing huge buildings into our landscape. We've got to think differently. The structure at the moment is like a pyramid. You end up with the client and the master planner, the architects, and all that team. Artists are often at the bottom, if they're at all, and that money is often a little philanthropic gesture, or it's a 106 in London. But the pyramid, it should be that way up. We should flip the triangle. It should be about ideas and content and partnerships and creativity and ideas filtering down to the most amazing brief.
So you need the masterpiece for the master plan then?
I think you do. You just, as I say, we're an anomaly in a way. I mean, Futurecity, we started 11 years ago, and we sort of stumbled into this sector. And I think what we began to do was just kind of question and push and ask all the dumb questions. But what was interesting was no one really pushed back. So the projects that we're involved in now globally are large-scale, well-funded, interesting projects with artists of, young and emerging artists, established artists, and they are a really important part of the thinking around our public realm, urban spaces, and so on.
So Vhils, I'd like to bring you back in, and then Sarah, on the role of, how often does a developer approach you to say, there's a wall over there, I need it painted, can you do a nice bit of graffiti for me? And how do you feel about that? I mean, what's the conflict in you between the kind of right projects and where you feel there's a real artistic compromise happening?
Well, there is more and more that kind of interests in a way, but from both sides. I think artists on one hand, at least the experience and from a lot of artists that come from these backgrounds, there was not a lot of opportunities at the beginning. There was not a lot of people trying to advocate for them, push for their careers and so on. So that's kind of a relatively new thing that is popping up. But a lot of these artists that actually started with murals, it was kind of not an affordable way to create their arts, because a lot of them, they can do three-dimensional work, they can do sculptures in the public space, they can even use ancient techniques. And when you bridge this kind of young generation of artists with the knowledge of different techniques that usually are associated with an high-hand art and production, you get very interesting results. And as you were saying, as soon as you start to have conditions and people kind of give you opportunity to create something with another type of means, you end up with a very interesting artworks. On the conceptual side, that's another question, which is really a challenge for keeping the artist manifesto and all this integrity. It is very difficult in a field where the public or the real estate or even government sometimes perceive these artists as an easy, very cheap way of having public art. And I think that's a challenge, and I think that's something very recent. We're talking about 10 years since this kind of process started. But I think you started to have both galleries, both companies that work with public art and that are advocating for creating a more respectful platform for discussion.
And you've in February you were in a big show in Shanghai, and I'd be interested in your feeling about the underground art scene in Shanghai. And you were saying obviously that there is a graffiti scene, but it all gets painted over very quickly. So is there any graffiti in China?
There is young artists, and I think it's a movement that's it's very related to the younger generation and really relates to the public, a younger public, and as the young public really relates to it as a kind of a image of their generation in a way. But on the government side, there's a few cases of dialogue, but not much. But it's kind of the private sector that is kind of bringing these artists, which I don't sometimes really think it's coherent.
It's interesting that most of this discussion is focused on private developers, private companies, not necessarily sort of mayors, cities, And Sarah, I'd just like to sort of get your feeling about sort of who's paying for this, who should be paying for sort of public art and thinking about it in a deeper way, and is anyone doing that?
Well, I think that I think that you have to start focusing on these public-private relationships because the budgets of certainly most American cities are too small to really have the impact that they want to have. And there's a very interesting example, the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council in New York, another New York City reference, but this is in terms of also like keeping the integrity of the ideas, the integrity of the artist's work, and also getting the designers and the artists in at the beginning. They did a project in Lower Manhattan where they worked with a developer on a a whole block site in Lower Manhattan, and they worked with the developer to get the site for a year. And the project, they engaged a young design office called Interborough, and they came up with a project called Lent Space. So they knew they had this space for a year. They made a public space, a public park, also public gardens, a place for art, a place for all kinds of people to engage. But they also used that to understand the site better. So for the future development of the site, that project informed how that site will get developed and used. And so I think that we need to be thinking really creatively and brokering these relationships between developers and whether they're independent nonprofit organizations or city agencies to find where the opportunity is and get people at the table at the very beginning.
Well, I'm going to not let Mark in, which is, I know you're raring to go,
Oh, no.
but I have just time for one or two quick questions from the audience. So if I can have the lights up slightly, and I can see a hand already to the right. And if you can just say who you are as well, please.
I'm Stephen Fisher, and I write and teach about luxury goods and luxury experiences. It seems that most of the art world today is becoming for the rich. And it's becoming more and more that they're the ones who are driving up the prices for the pieces of art, and the only artists who are being recognized are the ones who are able to sell at that level. Mid-market galleries are disappearing left and right. Just down the block from here, one gallery that was here for decades is now out of business. They're basically being decimated by Art Basel, things like that. My question for you is, what role does large cities or civic art projects have in developing younger and emerging art talent?
Vhils, I'd like to bring you in on this.
I mean, I don't completely agree with the fact that it's becoming for the rich, and especially coming from the graffiti and street art backgrounds. It's kind of a movement that's been dialoguing with a very young crowd as well, and there was a lot of projects related to screen print and editions that have bridged to a completely new public that it's relating to art in a way, and it's not at the high end of the spectrum. It's young people that don't have a lot of money to afford a big artwork that are supporting these artists, and the validation of these artists comes through that community of people that follow those artists. So I think there is still, even if there is a visual and what we get, that is on the high end of the market. I think there is as well a new generation that is relating to art in a very different way than there was for a long time.
Mark, is it just for the rich?
No, I think it varies from city to city. I don't know the situation in Chicago, but in London, the mayor's office, Deputy Mayor of Culture, has pushed really hard for studios to be embedded into real estate structures and live music and production space, and generally realizing, and I think younger urban developers are beginning to get that in some of the places I'm working, that actually you start pushing the artist out, you push out the lifeblood of the city. And if we do believe that the future is around culture and creativity and IP production, you've got to keep creatives in the city. You've got to retain them. So you have to work really hard. But again, what I've been very interested in is a sort of anti-them and us. The only way we're going to solve this is by working together, not just the public sector doing all the kind of heavy lifting and the private sector doing their own thing. I'll just give you a really good example in London of a project that's working really well. A local authority has worked with developers to take all the ground floor commercial space. They've then taken that off the developer in part of what we call a 106 negotiation, They've then gifted that to an arts charity, the Beaux Arts Trust, and they've then filled that with young creatives who are paying a very low rent. Everybody wins in that situation. It's in a sort of area where there's not a huge footfall. The commercial probably fail. And so now you have this really interesting ground floor use. Artists are getting cheap rent. We're retaining them and creating a really nice environment. So it can be done. It's exactly what I mean. It's not about them and us. It's about finding new ways to have a dialogue, I think.
One last quick question. I have one last quick question. So in fact, I have lots of last quick questions. So you all travel the world a lot, and I would love you to sort of talk to one or two very quickly, just to name the projects, to say why you're excited by them, that you'd love anyone in the audience to go and see if they can go and see them. So Vhils, I'll start with you.
I don't want to be a bit biased, but I think the example of what happened in Lisbon and the fact that of this bridge that's been set up of institutions and artists and so on, it came out with a lot of different projects that are very interesting, not just related to art, but also performance, intervention arts, even design. So it's a particular moment, as I lived abroad and worked abroad, I see it as a very particular environment with all the challenges between gentrification and progress and local communities struggling sometimes. It's a very interesting moment to really perceive how a relation to art and design and thoughtful of the public space can be very interesting. So you have several projects. I can name a few and send a few from in Lisbon that are creating a very interesting discussion. So I think it's an interesting place. And then Shanghai as well has a lot of interesting projects running with art in the public space.
Sarah?
Two projects I'm very excited about. One is the Sao Paulo Architecture Biennial, which will open this fall. It's the oldest architecture biennial in the world, and they're going to be looking at sort of architecture of the everyday and how everyday people live in architecture. And another project is another kind of itinerant biennial, the Manifesta project, which will be in Marseille next year. And it's a project that roams throughout Europe, and so opposed to being in any one city, is traveling throughout Europe, and we will find a new iteration and life in Marseille next year.
Brilliant. And Mark?
Okay, I mean, so as you fly into London, if you fly into Terminal 2, you will see Richard Wilson's sculpture, which is the size of a Boeing 747, hung on columns that were never designed for it and was originally the landscape budget, and we managed to persuade them to put the money into a major art project instead. You'll go down the river in next year and you'll see the first set of bridges by Leo Villarreal, which will turn into this extraordinary artwork for London. And if you have time, go to Greenwich in the east and go on the P5K, or which is now called the Tide, which is an elevated sculptural running track and art space designed by Charles Renfro for a development there, which was the landscape project originally and is now a major artwork. So they're all projects where effectively we've managed to get in early, flip budgets, convince them of an alternative, and amazing things have happened.
And I do have 50 seconds left, so I'm afraid that there are probably many people in the audience who do not know Chicago well, and I do want to, I love the city, and Sarah, you know it better than anyone. If you had to advocate to people in this room to go and see some amazing project in Chicago, and by the way, Vhils has also got a project in Chicago he was very modest about, Sarah, what would it be?
I mean, this city is a museum for architecture. You walk down the street and it's the history of modernism. I would take the architecture boat tour. You'll get a sort of taste of the whole, the kind of history of Chicago architecture. But you really can't go wrong. Just wander the streets, go to the neighborhoods. I mean, it really is the most important city for architecture in this country.
Go Chicago. With that, I'm going to finish the panel, and I want you to join me in thanking our panelists.